Jonathan Adams believed he had successfully edited his life, cutting out the chapters that no longer served his narrative of success. His past was a ghost, and his future was a glittering skyline he had built with his own 2 hands. Tonight was the celebration of that future, a grand gala with the perfect woman, Maureen Carter, adorning his arm like a priceless jewel. He stood on a precipice of triumph, the king of a glass and steel kingdom. But kingdoms built on buried truths have weak foundations. He didn't know that just a few miles away, his ex-wife, Lillian Brooks, was holding a positive pregnancy test, a secret that would become a key, and she was about to walk back into his perfectly curated life, not as a ghost of the past, but as the undeniable, unignorable mother of his future, with a lawyer by her side to ensure he couldn't just turn the page. The air in Jonathan Adams' penthouse was worth more than most people's homes. Filtered, temperature-controlled, and scented with something subtle and expensive, notes of sandalwood and success. From his 52nd floor vantage point, Chicago was a circuit board of shimmering lights, a city he felt he had not just conquered, but owned. It's perfect, isn't it? Maureen Carter's voice was like honeyed whiskey, smooth and intoxicating. She glided up behind him, her arms snaking around his waist. Her chin rested on his shoulder, her perfume a familiar, pleasant invasion of his senses. She was wearing a slip of silk that was probably a designer's name he was supposed to recognize. The view, or the fact that the Sterling-Thorne merger finally closed? John asked, his lips curving into a smile as he covered her hands with his own. Both, she murmured, kissing the side of his neck. One is the spoils. The other is the victory. Maureen understood him. Or rather, she understood the man he was now. The Jonathan Adams who graced magazine covers, the tech mogul who had turned a garage startup into a billion-dollar empire, Adams Innovations. She thrived in the reflected glow of his success, a perfect partner for this chapter of his life. She was beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious, a living, breathing testament to his good taste. Tonight's gala was the exclamation point on his victory. It was a fundraiser for inner-city tech education, but everyone knew its true purpose, to celebrate the merger and publicly anoint him as one of the city's undisputed titans. Maureen had planned every detail, from the ice sculptures carved into the Adams Innovations logo to the Michelin-starred chef flown in from Paris. Everything is set. The caterers are downstairs, the string quartet is tuning up, and my dress, she purred, is going to make every woman in the room hate me. He turned in her arms, looking at her properly. She was flawless, sculpted cheekbones, eyes the color of a summer sky, and a smile that could disarm world leaders. She was everything his ex-wife, Lillian, wasn't. The thought of Lillian was an unwelcome intrusion, a scratch on a perfect pane of glass. Lillian was gentle. She was novels and lukewarm tea, quiet walks in the park, and the smell of lavender. She was his past. A past he had loved, he reminded himself, but a past he had outgrown. Their divorce 6 months ago had been the final, necessary amputation of a life that no longer fit. He'd told himself it was amicable. He'd given her a generous settlement. The house in the suburbs she'd loved so much, his blessing to find a quiet, simple happiness that he could no longer provide. He'd convinced himself it was a kindness. He was a shark, and she was a dolphin. They simply couldn't swim in the same waters anymore. His ambition had been a current too strong for her, pulling him further and further out to sea, while she wanted to stay in the calm of the bay. The arguments had become circular and exhausting. You're never here, John. I'm building us a future, Lily. I don't want this future if you're not in it. He pushed the memory away, focusing on Moran's bright, expectant face. "You'll be the most beautiful thing in the room," he said, and he meant it. She was the queen for his new castle. Yet later, as he stood under the scalding spray of his shower, the ghost of Lillian returned. He remembered a night about 2 months ago. Loneliness, a rare bottle of wine, and a moment of weakness had led him to her doorstep. The familiar comfort of her presence had been a balm on his soul, weary from the constant battle of the boardroom. They had fallen into each other's arms, a desperate, final attempt to find the people they used to be. It was a mistake, a relapse. The next morning, the cold reality of his new life had reasserted itself. A call about the merger had come in, and he'd left before she woke up, leaving a text message that was both an apology and a final goodbye. He'd told himself it was for the best, a clean break this time. He hadn't spoken to her since. He had Moran now. He had the merger. He had everything he'd ever wanted. So why did he feel the hollow ache of a phantom limb, a sense of loss for something he had willingly cut away? He shook his head, water plastering his hair to his forehead. It was just pre-gala jitters. Tonight was a celebration. Tonight, he would show the world, and himself, that he had made the right choice. He was Jonathan Adams, and he never looked back. The house in Oak Park was quiet. It was the kind of quiet Lillian Brooks had once craved, a stark contrast to the buzzing, electric energy that had always surrounded John. Now, the silence felt heavy, pressing in on her from all sides. The generous settlement he'd given her had allowed her to keep their first home, a charming brick Tudor she'd lovingly decorated. But without him, it felt less like a home and more like a museum of a failed marriage. Lillian sat on the edge of the master bathroom's clawfoot tub, the one she'd insisted on when they'd renovated. In her hand, she held 3 pregnancy tests, all lined up on the cool porcelain. Each one showed the same terrifying, undeniable result. 2 blue lines, positive. A wave of nausea washed over her, and this time it had nothing to do with morning sickness. It was the icy dread of reality. Pregnant. She was pregnant with Jonathan's child. The memories of that night 2 months ago flooded back, unbidden. His unexpected arrival, the vulnerability in his eyes she hadn't seen since they were college kids, with nothing but debt and dreams. They had talked for hours, not as embittered exes, but as 2 people who had once known each other's souls. The wine, the soft music, the shared history. It had created a dangerous illusion of reconciliation. In the morning, he was gone. The text message he'd left felt like a slap in the face. Last night was special, Lily, but we both know we can't go back. Take care. He had taken care of it, moving on without a second glance, and he had left her with this, a tiny, secret life growing inside her. Her first call was to her older sister, Clara. "You have to tell him," Clara said, her voice firm but gentle through the phone. "How, Clara? Do I send him a text?" "Hey, John. Hope the billion-dollar merger went well. Bidvaru, you're going to be a dad." Her voice broke, a sob catching in her throat. "He's with her now. He'll think I planned this, that I'm trying to trap him." "Who cares what he thinks?" Clara shot back. "This isn't about him anymore. It's about you and that baby. That baby has a right to its father, and it has a right to the security that comes with him. You need to protect yourself, Lily. You need a lawyer." The idea felt cold, transactional, but Clara was right. Jonathan operated in a world of contracts and legal leverage. To approach him on purely emotional terms would be like bringing a poem to a gunfight. A week later, she found herself in the polished, minimalist office of David Chen, a family law attorney her sister had recommended. He wasn't the aggressive shark she'd feared. He was a calm, methodical man in his late 40s, with kind eyes and a reassuring demeanor. He listened patiently as she recounted the whole story, her voice trembling. "Miss Brooks." "Lillian," he said, leaning forward. "Legally, the situation is straightforward. Mr. Adams is the father, and he has a financial and, should you wish it, a parental obligation. The challenge, as you've identified, is him. Over the next few days, David began his preliminary research. What he found was unsettling. He's restructuring, David explained in their next meeting. The merger has provided him the perfect cover to move assets, create new shell corporations, and place funds into complex trusts. To a casual observer, it looks like standard post-merger housekeeping. To me, he paused, looking at her gravely. It looks like a man preparing to make himself legally untouchable. If we send a standard letter, his lawyers will bury us in paperwork for years. By the time we get anywhere, the money will be so hidden we'll never find it. Lillian's heart sank. It was the same old story. John, always 10 steps ahead, protecting his empire above all else. "So what do we do?" she whispered. David's expression was grim. "We can't play his game, so we have to change the rules. A quiet, private approach won't work. We need leverage. We need to force his hand in a way he can't ignore or escape." He slid a glossy magazine across the desk. It was a society publication, open to a page detailing Chicago's most anticipated event of the year, the Adams Innovations Foundation Gala. There was a photo of John and Maureen Carter, smiling, radiant, the city's new power couple. "He's hosting a massive charity gala this Friday," David said. "It's a celebration of his merger, a PR masterpiece. The entire city press, his business partners, his investors, they'll all be there." Lillian stared at the photo, a bitter taste in her mouth. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," David said, his voice even, "that you and I attend the gala. We deliver the news to him there, in public, in a place where he cannot run, hide, or deploy his army of lawyers, in a place where his carefully constructed public image is on the line." The thought was horrifying. Walking into his world, the one that had rejected her, and creating a scene. It went against every fiber of her being. She was a private person. This felt aggressive, cruel even. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "I can't do that to him." "Lillian," David's voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't about doing something to him. It's about doing something for your child. He has built walls of money and power around himself. We don't have the resources to tear them down brick by brick. We have to find the one door he left unlocked. And that door is his reputation." She looked down at her hands, resting protectively on her still flat stomach. A tiny, fluttering sensation, one she had been trying to ignore, made itself known. It was her baby. This wasn't just about her hurt feelings anymore. It was about this child who deserved a father and a future. John had built an empire to create a legacy. He was about to find out that legacy wasn't made of glass and steel. It was made of flesh and blood. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, something new was hardening. Resolve. "Okay," she said, her voice clearer now. "We'll go to the gala." The days leading up to the gala were a blur of nervous energy for both Jonathan and Lillian, two celestial bodies on an unalterable collision course. For John, the energy was triumphant. His office at Adams Innovations was a command center, buzzing with the final preparations. He moved through the chaos with a practiced ease, fielding calls from investors, approving press releases, and finalizing the seating chart with Maureen. "Senator Hayes cannot be seated next to Mr. Petroff," Maureen said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the digital floor plan. Their companies are in a bidding war. It would be a disaster. Move Petrov to table 9. Put him with the Arts Council people. They'll find his brooding Russian thing charming, John said, without looking up from his tablet, where he was reviewing his speech. It was a masterpiece of corporate rhetoric, filled with words like synergy, innovation, and legacy. He'd written it himself, wanting every word to be perfect. This speech was his coronation. He felt a deep, satisfying hum of power. Everything was aligning. His business, his public image, his personal life. Morin was the perfect co-host, effortlessly charming and ruthlessly efficient. She navigated the complex social politics of the city's elite with a skill that impressed even him. They were a team, a power couple. One afternoon, his longtime assistant, Maria, poked her head into his office. "Mr. Adams, your personal finance manager is on line 3. He said it's about the asset reallocation you requested." "Patch him through," John said. He'd been working with his financial team for weeks to restructure his personal holdings, moving the bulk of his liquid assets into a series of newly formed, impenetrable blind trusts. It was just good business sense. The merger made him a bigger target for lawsuits, for opportunists. It was about protecting what he'd built. He never once thought of it in relation to Lillian. She was taken care of. She was the past. "Everything is in place, John," his manager said. "By Monday morning, you'll be more liquid and more protected than ever." "Excellent," John replied, a wave of satisfaction washing over him. "That's excellent news." He hung up and looked out the window. His legacy was secure. For Lillian, the energy was one of mounting dread. The simple, elegant maternity dress she'd bought hung on the back of her bedroom door like a judge's robe. It was a deep navy blue, professional, yet soft. It was the armor she would wear into battle. She felt like a fraud. She spent her days grading middle school English papers, trying to find solace in the familiar routine. But her mind was elsewhere. It was in a glittering ballroom downtown, playing out a scene that felt like something from a movie, not her life. "Are you sure about this?" she asked David Chen on the phone the night before the gala. Her voice was a small, frightened thing. "I'm more sure than ever," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My sources confirm he just finalized a major restructuring of his personal assets. If we had waited until next week, Lillian, we would be facing a very different and much more difficult fight. He's closing the gates. We have to get through them before they shut for good." His words didn't make her brave, but they made her resolute. It was like standing at the edge of a high dive. The fear was paralyzing, but the thought of climbing all the way back down was worse. She had to jump. On the evening of the gala, Clara came over to help her get ready. "You look powerful," Clara said, zipping up the back of the navy dress. Lillian looked at her reflection. The dress skimmed over a belly that was now a small but definite curve. It was the gentle swell of new life, a stark contrast to the destruction she felt she was about to cause. "I feel sick," Lillian confessed. "That's the warrior's fear before the battle," Clara said, placing her hands on Lillian's shoulders. "You're not the timid girl he left behind anymore, Lily. You're a mother. Remember that. You're doing this for your child." When David Chen arrived, he was holding a simple, professional leather briefcase. Inside was a single manila envelope. It contained a petition for establishment of paternity and a formal request for a co-parenting and child support agreement, citing Jonathan Adams as the father. It was cold, legal, and absolute. "Ready?" David asked softly. Lillian took a deep breath, her hand instinctively going to her belly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. She thought of John, standing on a stage, talking about his legacy. A bitter irony twisted inside her. He was about to come face to face with the one legacy he couldn't control, list on a stock exchange, or hide in a trust. The grand ballroom of the Peninsula Hotel was transformed. It was a cathedral of modern wealth, bathed in the cool blue and silver light of the Adams Innovations brand. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables laden with floral arrangements that cost more than Lillian's monthly mortgage. A string quartet played Vivaldi in one corner, their classic melodies a genteel soundtrack for the ferocious networking happening around them. The air was thick with expensive perfume, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the low hum of 100 conversations about money and power. Jonathan Adams was in his element. He moved through the crowd with the easy grace of a king in his court. He shook hands with a senator, shared a laugh with a venture capitalist, and kissed the cheek of a society doyenne. Maureen was a seamless extension of him, her silver sequined gown catching the light with every movement. She was dazzling, a star in her own right, and together they were a constellation. "He's a force of nature, isn't he?" a banking executive murmured to his wife, watching John command the room. "And that Maureen Carter," the wife replied. "She's the perfect accessory." At the podium, John tapped the microphone, and a hush fell over the room. The lights dimmed slightly, focusing all attention on him. "Good evening," he began, his voice resonant and confident. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate a new chapter, not just for Adams Innovations, but for Chicago." He spoke of the future, of technology as a great equalizer, of his foundation's commitment to empowering the next generation. He was charming, inspiring, and completely convincing. Lillian, had she been there, would have recognized the speech's cadence. It was his "I can sell you anything" voice, the one he used to win over investors and board members. "Building something that lasts," he continued, his eyes sweeping the room, "is about more than just profit margins and stock prices. It's about legacy. It's about creating a future that is better, brighter, and more connected than the world we were given." His eyes found Maureen at the front table. He smiled, a genuine, intimate smile that the cameras eagerly captured. "And I'm incredibly lucky to be building that future with an extraordinary partner." He raised his glass. "To the future." "To the future," the room echoed, a chorus of adulation. The applause was thunderous. John stepped away from the podium, basking in the warm glow of success. He had done it. He was on top of the world, untouchable. It was in that precise moment of supreme triumph that the grand oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. They didn't make a sound, but their presence cut through the celebratory din like a blade. Two figures, silhouetted against the bright light of the hotel lobby. One was a man in a simple, dark suit, holding a briefcase. The other was a woman. It was Lillian Brooks. She wasn't wearing sequins or diamonds. Her navy blue dress was a whisper in a room of shouts. Her hair was pulled back simply, her face pale but serene. She wasn't wearing the heartbroken expression of a jilted lover. She looked composed, resolute, and as she stepped forward into the light of the ballroom, a collective gasp rippled through the nearest tables. She was pregnant. It wasn't overt, not yet a grand, sweeping curve of late-term pregnancy, but it was undeniable. A gentle, proud swell beneath the dark fabric of her dress that announced its presence with quiet authority. John saw her. His smile froze on his face, a brittle, unnatural thing. The champagne flute in his hand felt suddenly heavy, cold. The noise of the room seemed to fade into a dull roar, like the sound of the ocean through a seashell. All he could see was her, walking toward him. It was a long walk, 100 feet of plush carpet that felt like a mile. With every step she took, the whispers grew. Is that? My God, it's Lillian Adams, Brooks now. Is she pregnant? Who is that man with her? Moran, still standing near the stage, followed John's line of sight. Her smile faltered. Confusion flickered in her eyes, quickly replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. She looked from Lillian's determined face to the slight curve of her stomach, then back to John's ashen expression. The triumphant glow was gone from her face, replaced by the icy shock of public humiliation. Lillian didn't look at Moran. She didn't look at the gawking senators or the whispering socialites. Her eyes were fixed on one person, Jonathan. She walked past tables of people she had once hosted in her home, people who now stared at her as if she were an apparition. David Chen walked calmly beside her, a silent, steadying presence. He was her shield and her weapon. He surveyed the room with the dispassionate gaze of a man who was there to do a job, utterly unimpressed by the wealth and power on display. They stopped less than 10 feet from the stage, directly in front of John. The string quartet had faltered into silence. The entire room was holding its breath. The only sound was the frantic, almost silent clicking of a few journalists' phone cameras. This was a story. This was the story. John's world, so solid and glittering just moments before, had fractured. Through the cracks, the past was pouring in, and it was about to drown him. Time seemed to slow down. For Jonathan, the ballroom felt like a fishbowl, and he was the specimen pinned under the glare of 100 pairs of eyes. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. There was only Lillian, standing before him, a quiet indictment of the life he had so carefully constructed. He opened his mouth to say something, her name, a question, an accusation, but no words came out. His throat was tight with a cocktail of shock, fear, and a sudden, gut-wrenching guilt. Lillian's expression was unreadable. It wasn't anger, not the fiery rage he might have expected. It was a profound, weary calm. The look of someone who had already weathered the storm internally and was now just navigating the wreckage. David Chen stepped forward slightly. With a calm, deliberate movement, he opened his briefcase, retrieved the manila envelope, and held it out to John. It was not a plea. It was a summons. Mr. Adams. David's voice was clear and steady, cutting through the thick silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of legal authority. My name is David Chen. I represent Ms. Lillian Brooks. John stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't take it. It was Lillian who finally spoke. Her voice, though soft, was amplified by the unnatural quiet of the room. It was aimed only at him, yet everyone heard it. Jonathan, she said, and his name on her lips was a ghost of 1,000 memories. We need to talk. She paused, and her gaze flickered down for a fraction of a second, an almost imperceptible nod toward her stomach before meeting his eyes again. We need to talk about our child's future. Our child. The two words detonated in the center of the ballroom. The whispers erupted into a wave of shocked murmurs. The camera flashes became a frenzy. Moran Carter made a small, wounded sound, a choked gasp of disbelief and betrayal. Her face, a mask of perfect hostessship just minutes before, had crumbled into raw, naked humiliation. She looked at John, her eyes searching for a denial, an explanation, anything. He offered nothing. He couldn't. He was paralyzed, caught in the headlights of his own deceit. He had never told her about that night with Lillian. He had buried it, compartmentalized it as a final, soured footnote to a closed chapter. Now, that footnote had become the headline. Moran's face hardened. The hurt in her eyes was quickly eclipsed by a cold, sharp fury. Without another word, she turned on her heel, her silver dress a streak of light as she pushed her way through the stunned crowd and fled the ballroom. The sound of the doors swinging shut behind her was like a gunshot. John was alone, utterly, publicly alone. His eyes darted around the room, seeing not friends and colleagues, but judges and jury. He saw the gleam of schadenfreude in the eyes of his rivals, the pity in the faces of his allies, the frenzied hunger of the press. His perfect night, his perfect image, his perfect future, all of it lay in smoking ruins at his feet. David Chen, seeing that John was still frozen, took a step forward and placed the envelope gently on the table next to him, beside his uneaten dessert. "We will expect to hear from your legal counsel within 48 hours, David said quietly, but with an air of finality. Then he and Lillian turned and walked away. They moved with the same deliberate calm with which they had arrived, parting the sea of onlookers. They didn't run. They didn't look back. They simply exited, leaving behind a silence more damning than any accusation. The moment the doors closed behind them, the dam of decorum broke. The room exploded in a cacophony of noise. John stood motionless, the architect of a fallen kingdom, hearing nothing but the frantic beating of his own heart and the echo of two words: "Our child." The fallout was immediate and brutal. By the time John stumbled out of the hotel through a back exit, avoiding the swarm of reporters at the front, his phone was already a vessel of digital carnage. Headlines flashed across his screen, each one a fresh twist of the knife. Tech mogul, Jonathan Adams Gala, interrupted by pregnant ex-wife. A tale of two women. Mistress flees as ex-wife reveals secret baby. Adams Innovations, merger celebration, turns into personal scandal. The world he had meticulously controlled had turned on him overnight. The next morning, the market opened, and Adams Innovations stock took a noticeable dip. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. His investors were spooked, not by the baby, but by the optics. The scandal suggested recklessness, poor judgment, a lack of control, qualities anathema to the stable, visionary leader he had sold them on. But the corporate crisis barely registered. John was trapped in a far more personal hell. He holed up in his penthouse, the curtains drawn, the silence a suffocating blanket. The calls went unanswered. His world had shrunk to the four walls of his gilded cage, and the only voice he heard was the one in his head, playing his failures on a loop. He wasn't angry at Lillian. The initial shock had given way to a tidal wave of guilt so profound it was physically nauseating. He drank. He stared at the city lights, the same view that had filled him with triumph just days ago, and felt nothing but emptiness. His mind replayed his entire relationship with Lillian. He remembered her typing his college papers while he worked late in the computer lab. He remembered her bringing him coffee at 3 a.m. when he was coding the first version of his software in their tiny apartment. She had been his foundation, the quiet, unwavering belief beneath his soaring ambition. And how had he repaid her? He had taken her for granted. He'd cancelled dinners for meetings, missed anniversaries for product launches, and replaced intimacy with expensive gifts. He had told himself he was building a future for them, but he had built it alone, and in the process, he had left her behind. The memory of their last night together haunted him most of all. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been a moment of clarity. In her arms, he had felt a peace that his billions and his new life with Moran could never provide. It was a glimpse of the man he used to be, the man she had loved, and he had run from it. He had woken up the next morning, seen her sleeping peacefully, and been terrified. That peace felt like a threat to his ambition, a siren song calling him back to a simpler shore. So he had fled, leaving only a coward's text message. He had chosen the empire over the woman who had helped him build it. And now, in the wreckage of his public life, he finally understood. The empire was cold. It was glass and steel and numbers on a screen. Lillian, their shared past, and the future growing inside her, that was real. He finally opened the manila envelope. The legal jargon was dense, but the meaning was clear. It wasn't a vindictive money grab. It was a formal, structured plan for the future of a child he had fathered and abandoned in the same breath. His phone rang again. It was Moran. He finally answered. Her voice was cold, stripped of all its former warmth. "I hope you're happy, John." "Moran, Don't," she cut him off. "Don't you dare try to apologize. It's not even that you slept with her. It's that you let me stand there, next to you, smiling like an idiot. You made me part of your lie. You're a coward, John. You talk about legacy and building the future, but you couldn't even face your own past." The line went dead. She was right. He was a coward. He sank onto his leather sofa, the legal documents scattered on the cushion beside him, and for the first time since he was a child, Jonathan Adams wept. He wasn't crying for his stock price or his reputation. He was crying for the man he had failed to be, for the woman he had so deeply wronged, and for the child who deserved so much better than him. After 3 days marinating in whiskey and self-loathing, Jonathan looked at his reflection in the dark screen of his television. He saw a man who had everything and deserved none of it. The hollow-eyed stranger staring back at him was not a titan of industry. He was a cliché, a rich fool brought low by his own hubris. Something had to change. His first instinct, the old John's instinct, was to fight. He called his corporate lawyer, a ruthless litigator named Marcus Thorne, who had made a career out of crushing opponents. "We can bury her, John," Marcus said, his voice oozing aggressive confidence. "We'll question the timeline, demand multiple paternity tests, file motions to seal everything, drag it out until she gives up. We'll paint her as an opportunist." Every word made John's stomach turn. That was the old playbook. Demolish, deny, dominate. But that strategy had led him here, alone in his penthouse, with nothing but the bitter taste of regret. To attack Lillian now would be the ultimate act of cowardice, a final, unforgivable betrayal. "No," John said, his voice raspy. "No, Marcus, we're not doing that." "John, this is not the time to go soft." "You're fired, Marcus," John said, and hung up the phone before the man could reply. It was the first decision he'd made in days that didn't feel wrong. He looked at the legal documents on his table, at the name and number printed at the bottom. David Chen. With a trembling hand, he dialed. He expected to get a secretary, to have to leave a message. But David Chen answered on the second ring. "Chen speaking." "Mr. Chen, this is Jonathan Adams." There was a brief pause on the other end. No surprise, no smugness, just professional calm. "Mr. Adams, I was expecting to hear from your counsel." "I don't have counsel anymore," John said, the words feeling strange and liberating. "Not for this. I don't want to fight. I want to meet. With you and with Lillian. I want to do what's right." "Do." The silence on the line stretched for a moment. John could picture the lawyer on the other end, assessing, wondering if this was a new tactic. "That is a welcome development, Mr. Adams," David finally said, his tone still cautious. "I will speak with my client and see if she is amenable to a meeting. We will be in touch." Hanging up the phone, John felt a sliver of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not power, not pride, but purpose. It was a terrifyingly small first step on a very long road, but it was a step in the right direction. He spent the rest of the day taking more steps. He called the chairman of his board and told him the truth. Not the curated PR version, but the unvarnished, ugly story. He apologized for the scandal and told them he was taking a leave of absence to deal with his personal life, effective immediately. He was ceding temporary control of his empire. For the first time, he was prioritizing something else. Later that week, David Chen called back. Lillian had agreed to a meeting, but she had a condition. Not in a boardroom, not in an office, a neutral place. She suggested a small, quiet cafe in a neighborhood neither of them frequented. It was a place without ghosts. John agreed immediately. He knew this wasn't about legal posturing anymore. This was a test to see if he could show up not as a mogul, but as a man. The cafe was a small, unassuming place with mismatched wooden tables and the warm, inviting smell of coffee and baked bread. It was the antithesis of John's world. There was no valet, no maitre d', no one who knew or cared who he was. He arrived early, dressed in simple jeans and a sweater, feeling more nervous than he had before any board meeting. Lillian and David arrived a few minutes later. Lillian looked tired, the strain of the past weeks visible in the faint shadows under her eyes. But she also looked strong. When her eyes met his, there was no hatred in them, just a guarded quietness. She gave him a stiff, almost imperceptible nod and sat down. David Chen opened his briefcase, but he didn't pull out a stack of papers. The atmosphere was tense, the silence broken only by the clink of ceramic mugs. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," John began, his voice low. "Lillian, I am so sorry. For everything. For the gala. For how I left." Lillian's hands were wrapped around a mug of herbal tea. She didn't respond immediately, just watched him, her gaze unwavering. "I didn't come here for an apology, John," she said finally, her voice steady. "I came here to talk about our baby." David Chen took that as his cue. "We have prepared a proposal," he said, sliding a single folder across the table. "It outlines a request for a comprehensive trust fund for the child, to be managed by an independent third party. It covers all future educational and medical expenses, including health insurance, starting immediately." John opened the folder. It was exactly what he expected, and he was prepared to agree to it all, to double it if he had to. "This is all fine. It's more than reasonable. Whatever you want, whatever the baby needs, it's done." He looked up, expecting to see relief on Lillian's face. Instead, her expression tightened. "That's not all," she said. She slid a second piece of paper out of her own handbag. It wasn't a legal document. It was a handwritten page, filled with her neat, familiar cursive. "This isn't about your money, John. I don't want it for myself. The trust is for the child, to protect them. This," she tapped the paper, "is about you." John took the paper. It was a proposed co-parenting plan. It detailed visitation schedules, holiday arrangements, and decisions about schooling. It spoke of weekly father-daughter days, of him being present for doctor's appointments, of him taking an active role in the child's life. It wasn't a list of demands. It was a roadmap for fatherhood. "I don't want my child to have a bank account for a father," Lillian said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, but her gaze was fierce. "I want them to have a dad. Someone who shows up. Someone who is present and accounted for. The question isn't whether you can afford this baby, John. It's whether you're willing to raise it." The question hung in the air, far more challenging than any financial negotiation. She wasn't attacking him. She was challenging him to be better. She was offering him a chance, not just to pay for his mistake, but to atone for it. He looked from her earnest, searching face to the handwritten schedule. He thought of his own father, a man who had always been too busy, a distant figure he'd only known through a handful of awkward fishing trips. He had sworn he would be different, and he had failed spectacularly. This was his chance to stop failing. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked directly at Lillian, wanting her to see the sincerity in his eyes. "Yes, I want to be a father. Her father." For the first time, a flicker of something other than guarded resolve crossed Lillian's face. It was a fragile, tentative glimmer of hope. The negotiation wasn't over. In fact, the hardest part was just beginning. Words were easy. Action was the currency that mattered now. Jonathan knew that his yes in the cafe meant nothing if it wasn't followed by a fundamental change in his life. The reckoning had begun, and it was a quiet, internal, and profoundly difficult process. His leave of absence from Adam's innovations stretched from weeks into months. He didn't just cede control. He began to disentangle his identity from the company he had built. He started by selling the penthouse. The glass and steel cage, once a symbol of his triumph, now felt like a monument to his loneliness. He bought a house, a real house with a yard, in a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood, just a 10-minute drive from Lillian's. The biggest change was in how he spent his time. His calendar, once packed with back-to-back meetings and international flights, was now filled with different kinds of appointments. He attended parenting classes online, feeling like an imposter among the cheerful, expectant couples. He sat alone in his new empty house, assembling a crib, his engineering skills feeling clumsy and inadequate as he struggled with the instructions. He read books, not about market trends or investment strategies, but about infant sleep schedules and child development. He and Lillian communicated mostly through a co-parenting app David Chen had recommended. It was a sterile, safe space to discuss logistics, doctor's appointments, updates on her health, questions about the baby registry. The conversations were stilted and awkward, but they were consistent. "John, Dr. Miller's office confirmed your 28-week appointment for Tuesday at 10 a.m. I know you prefer to go alone, but I'll be in the waiting room if you need anything." Lillian: "Thank you. That's fine." He kept his promise. He was there for every appointment, a silent presence in the waiting room. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give. He was earning trust back one tiny, painstaking deposit at a time. There were setbacks. One evening, he called her, wanting to ask about a specific brand of car seat he'd been researching. His call caught her at a bad moment. She was exhausted and hormonal, and his clinical, research-driven approach felt intrusive. "It's not a business acquisition, John," she snapped, her voice frayed. "You can't just optimize everything. This is a baby, not a product." She hung up, and John was left holding the phone, the sting of her words a sharp reminder of how much he still had to learn. The old John would have been angry, defensive. The new John just felt a pang of shame. He texted her a simple message. "You're right, I'm sorry." A few days later, she texted back. "I'm sorry too. It's the Graco Snug Ride. It has the best safety ratings." It was a small olive branch, but it felt monumental. He began setting up the nursery in his new house. He painted the walls a soft, gender-neutral yellow. He assembled a bookshelf and, in a moment of inspiration, filled it not with business books, but with the classic children's stories Lillian loved, the ones she used to read to him on quiet Sunday mornings. He sent her a photo when it was done. Her only reply was a single word. Lovely. He was learning a new language, the language of presence, of quiet support, of showing up without expecting a reward. It was humbling, frustrating, and more fulfilling than any deal he had ever closed. He wasn't just building a nursery. He was building a space for a new version of himself, a man he hoped his child could one day call Dad. Lillian was 36 weeks pregnant, and the weight of it, physical and emotional, was immense. She was tired of being pregnant, tired of the awkward dance with John, tired of the uncertainty. Yet, she couldn't deny the change in him. The consistency of his efforts had slowly eroded her walls of distrust. The man in the waiting room, the man who researched car seats and texted apologies, was not the man who had abandoned her. One Tuesday evening, a sharp, terrifying cramp seized her abdomen. It was sudden and intense, stealing her breath. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through her. It was too early. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling. Her first instinct was to call her sister, but she was out of town. The next name on her recent calls list was John's. Without thinking, she pressed it. He answered on the first ring. "Lily, is everything okay?" "I don't know," she gasped, another wave of pain hitting her. "Something's wrong. It hurts." The change in his voice was instantaneous. The calm, steady man from the co-parenting app was gone, replaced by pure, focused concern. "Where are you? I'm coming. Stay on the phone with me." He was there in less than 10 minutes. He didn't knock, just used the spare key she had reluctantly given him for emergencies. He found her on the sofa, pale and frightened. He didn't hesitate. He helped her to her feet, grabbed the hospital bag she had packed weeks ago, and guided her to his car with a gentle but firm hand on her back. At the hospital, they were ushered into a triage room. The nurses hooked Lillian up to monitors, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the baby's heartbeat filling the small, sterile space. It was a false alarm. Braxton Hicks contractions, the nurse explained kindly, intensified by stress and dehydration. The baby was fine. The relief was so overwhelming that Lillian began to cry, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. John, who had been standing tensely in the corner, pulled a chair up to her bedside. He didn't say, "I told you so," or "Don't worry." He just reached out and, after a moment's hesitation, took her hand. His hand was warm and steady. "It's okay," he murmured. "We're okay. The word settled in the quiet room, holding a new kind of weight. For the first time in months, they weren't ex-spouses or legal adversaries. They were just two scared, expectant parents. "I was so scared," she confessed, her voice thick. "Me too," he admitted, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "When you called, my whole world just stopped." They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the steady beat of their child's heart on the monitor. They talked, really talked, for the first time since the cafe. Not about schedules or lawyers, but about their fears. His fear of failing, of not knowing how to be a good father. Her fear of doing it alone, of not being enough. "You're going to be a great mom, Lily," he said, his voice full of a conviction that surprised them both. "You were always the heart of our home. You're kind and patient and strong." She looked at him, at the genuine earnestness in his eyes. "You're not the same person you were a year ago, John." "I hope not," he said softly. "That guy was an idiot." A small smile touched her lips. It wasn't a romantic reconciliation. The wounds were too deep for that. But it was something else, something arguably more precious. It was a moment of grace, a glimmer of hope that they could build something new and good out of the wreckage of their past, for the sake of the future sleeping soundly in the room with them. 2 weeks later, Chloe Rose Brooks Adams was born, not with drama or fear, but in the calm early hours of a Wednesday morning. Jonathan was there, just as he'd promised. He wasn't in the waiting room this time. Lillian had asked him to be with her. He held Lillian's hand through the contractions, fed her ice chips, and murmured words of encouragement, his voice a steady anchor in her sea of pain. When the doctor finally placed the tiny wailing baby onto Lillian's chest, John felt his own world shift on its axis. The nurse swaddled Chloe and handed her to him. He held his daughter for the first time, his large hands looking clumsy and oversized around her fragile body. She was so small, so perfect. Her tiny fingers curled around his thumb. In that moment, the last vestiges of the old Jonathan Adams, the mogul, the tycoon, the king of a glass and steel kingdom, crumbled into dust. All that was left was a father, humbled and overwhelmed by a love so fierce it stole his breath. He looked over at Lillian, who was watching them with weary, shining eyes, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that this tiny 7-pound life was his true legacy. 6 months later, the August sun filtered through the leaves of a large oak tree in Lincoln Park. The air was warm, filled with the distant laughter of children and the lazy buzz of cicadas. Lillian spread a blanket on the grass, while John carefully unbuckled Chloe from her stroller. He lifted her out, and she gurgled, her wide blue eyes, his eyes, blinking in the dappled sunlight. He sat on the blanket opposite Lillian, propping Chloe up between them. Their interactions were a practiced, easy rhythm now. Not the effortless dance of a couple in love, but the functional, respectful choreography of co-parents. They passed toys back and forth, took turns making silly faces that made Chloe giggle, and talked about her latest milestones. She was starting to roll over. She loved sweet potatoes. She hated hats. A young couple walked by, hand in hand, and glanced at them, likely assuming they were a perfect little family enjoying a day in the park. The reality was more complex, and in its own way, more beautiful. "The board wants me to consider coming back," John said quietly, not taking his eyes off Chloe as she grabbed for a brightly colored rattle. "In a reduced, advisory role." Lillian looked at him. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd think about it," he said. "I told them my priorities are different now." He looked up and met her gaze. "My priority is right here." There was no grand declaration of love, no dramatic kiss. There was no fairy tale ending where they bought a new house and lived happily ever after. Their romantic chapter was closed. But a new one, a story of forgiveness, respect, and shared love for their daughter, was just beginning. Lillian reached out and gently brushed a stray leaf from Chloe's head. Her fingers brushed against John's as they both adjusted the baby's sunbonnet. It was a simple, unconscious touch, a moment of shared purpose. They were not what they had been, but they had built something new from the ruins, a family, redefined. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And under the warm August sun, surrounded by the quiet hum of life, it was more than enough. It was a new beginning. This story is a powerful reminder that our greatest mistakes don't have to define our future. It's about the hard, messy, but beautiful work of earning a second chance. What did you think of Jonathan's transformation? Could you forgive him if you were Lillian? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share it with someone who believes in the power of redemption and new beginnings. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life stories that explore the depths of the human heart.